My name is Wren Larkin. I'm 33 years old. And on the 1-year anniversary of my grandfather's death, I stood in my parents' dining room and set a small wooden box on the table, a box that had been hidden inside his workbench for who knows how long, and told my family that everything they thought they knew about his estate was a story my father had built to cover something much worse than favoritism. My mother thought I was there to share a memory. My father thought I was there to finally let the inheritance go, the way I always let everything go. Neither of them knew what was actually inside that box, or that I'd spent the last 8 months learning exactly how long my father had been stealing from his own dying father while telling the rest of us there was nothing left. I want to tell you about that box, but first I have to take you back to a workshop that smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, and a man who taught me everything I know about what it actually means to build something that lasts. Welcome back to Frost Narratives. If you've ever watched your family hand your inheritance to a favored sibling and call it fairness, stay with me, because what I found hidden in a piece of furniture I'd owned for 15 years is the reason my father's face went the color of drywall dust at that table. I grew up in Millbridge, Vermont, in a house that always felt one bad year away from falling apart financially, even though nobody ever said that part out loud. My father, Desmond, ran a small industrial supply company he'd inherited the bones of from a business partner years before I was born, and it never quite thrived the way he told people it did. My mother, Corrine, kept our house looking like it belonged to people with more money than we had, which took a kind of constant, exhausting effort I didn't understand until I was old enough to notice the pattern behind it. I have one sister, Blythe, 2 years younger, and if you want the whole shape of my childhood in a single image, picture this. I got a second-hand bicycle for my 10th birthday, repainted by my grandfather in his workshop until it looked brand new. Blythe got a real one, boxed from the store the same year, because my mother said Blythe needed things to look new to feel loved. Nobody ever explained to me why I apparently didn't. That was the shape of it always. Blythe was the one my parents dressed up and showed off. I was the one they sent to Grandpa's when things got tight, which, looking back, was most weekends. I remember one specific afternoon that still sits in my chest exactly where it landed. I was 9, and my elementary school held a father-daughter woodworking day, one of those small community events meant to feel wholesome and nothing more. My father canceled that morning, something about a client call he couldn't move, and drove Blythe to a dance recital across town instead, because hers had a firm start time and mine, he said, was really more of a come-and-go thing anyway. Gus showed up in my father's place without anyone asking him to. He'd heard about it secondhand from my mother the night before and simply appeared, in his work boots, in a gymnasium full of other kids' fathers, and spent 2 hours helping me build a lopsided little birdhouse I still keep on a shelf in my own workshop today. He never once mentioned that he'd noticed my father wasn't there. He just showed up, the way he always did, and let his showing up be the whole conversation. My grandfather, Augustus Larkin, everyone called him Gus, ran a small furniture workshop out of a converted barn behind the house he'd shared with my grandmother, Faye, until she died when I was 11. He built custom pieces, mostly for people 2 counties over who valued craftsmanship over speed, the kind of work that never made anyone rich but always made Gus quietly, completely content. My father used to talk about the workshop the way you'd talk about a hobby somebody never grew out of. "Dad's still out there playing with his wood," he'd say at dinner, and my mother would laugh the small, polite laugh she reserved for things she found beneath her. I loved it out there more than anywhere else on earth. Gus taught me how to read the grain of a board before I could read a chapter book on my own. He taught me that a joint cut true doesn't need glue to hold, that glue is what you use to cover up a cut that wasn't true in the first place. He had one rule about the workshop that I heard so many times growing up, it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like the only fact I actually trusted. "Anybody can make something look finished," he'd say, running his thumb along a seam. Took me 40 years to learn how to make something actually be finished. There's a difference, Rennie, and most people never learn it. Blythe came out to the workshop exactly twice in her whole childhood, both times under duress, both times complaining about the smell and the sawdust, and leaving within 20 minutes to go do something with our mother instead. Nobody ever pushed her to try again. I don't think anyone in my family, other than Gus, ever really understood that watching her walk away from something my mother could not stand to watch me love felt like its own quiet kind of proof. Proof that whatever I was, it wasn't the thing that got you chosen in that house. I started working as Gus's shop assistant the summer I turned 14, sweeping, sanding, learning to strip old finishes with a patience that surprised even him. By college, I was taking on small restoration jobs of my own on the side, using tools he'd handed down to me one at a time, like each one was a promotion I hadn't asked for but had somehow earned anyway. I opened my own shop, Larkin Restorations, 3 years after I graduated, in a converted garage 20 minutes from Gus's own barn, close enough that I could still drive over most Sundays and watch him work. Close enough that some of my earliest paying clients were people he'd sent my way with a quiet word and total confidence I hadn't yet earned for myself. My parents' reaction to the shop was polite in the specific way that tells you everything. "That's nice for you," my mother said, the same tone she used for things she found beneath her. My father asked, more than once, when I was going to do something real, as if 40 hours a week with my hands on a lathe wasn't real, as if the mortgage I paid on time every month with money I'd earned myself wasn't real. Meanwhile, Blythe, who worked in interior design and had built a modest but growing following posting home renovation content online, got introduced at every family gathering as our designer. I got introduced, when I got introduced at all, as Wren, she does the furniture thing. If you've ever built something real with your own hands and still gotten introduced like a hobbyist at your own family's table, comment the furniture thing below, because it took me until I was 32 to understand exactly how much that phrase had been doing to me quietly, for years. Here's the part that matters most, so hold on to it. 8 years ago, when I was 25, Gus had a heart scare. Nothing fatal, a procedure and a long recovery, but it scared everyone, including him, enough that he agreed, reluctantly, to let my father take over managing his business accounts, temporarily, just until he was steady on his feet again. My father got power of attorney over the workshop's finances that spring. I remember him telling the family at dinner how relieved he was that Dad had finally let someone help him, how it was about time somebody looked after the old man properly. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was 25, running my own shop, still learning how much I didn't know about my own family. I had no idea that spring was the beginning of something that would take me 8 more years and one hidden box to fully understand. Gus recovered. He went back to work within the year, slower than before but still Gus, still out in that barn every morning by 7 with coffee and a radio playing the same country station he'd listened to since before I was born. My father never formally handed the finances back over. Nobody in the family ever asked why. I think, looking back, we'd all just gotten so used to the idea of Dad helping that it stopped registering as something that had actually happened, the way you stop noticing a hum in a house until the day it finally goes quiet. There were small moments, scattered across those 8 years, that I filed away without ever really looking at them. Gus mentioning, almost offhand, that he'd had to turn down a commission because the account's a little tight right now, Rennie, from a man who used to keep a full season of orders backed up. My father showing up in a new truck the same spring Gus mentioned that tightness, calling it a good deal a client passed along. Gus at 80. Still repairing his own work boots with contact cement instead of buying new ones, in a family where my parents redid their kitchen twice in the same decade. Individually, none of it looked like anything. I understand now that it was never supposed to look like anything, one piece at a time. That was the whole design. Gus never once complained. That's the thing about my grandfather that I understand so much more clearly now than I did then. He was a man who could tell you, from across a room, that a table leg was off by a 1/16 of an inch, but he let something far bigger than that go unremarked for 8 years, in his own house, with his own son, because he had decided, somewhere along the way, that piece in the family was worth more to him than being right out loud. I know now that he wasn't actually staying quiet. He was documenting, but I didn't understand that yet. Nobody did. Gus died a little over a year before that dinner table conversation, in his sleep, at 81, the kind of quiet ending you'd wish on anyone you loved, and it still knocked the floor out from under all of us. I found out from a phone call at 6 in the morning, my father's voice flat and strange, telling me Dad was gone before I'd even fully understood who Dad meant in that sentence, because he almost never called Gus that. I drove to Millbridge with my hands, shaking so badly, I had to pull over twice. The funeral was small, exactly the way Gus would have wanted it. A handful of old clients and neighbors, and one man I didn't recognize at the time. An older man in a good gray coat who stood at the back and didn't come up to speak to anyone, who I'd later come to know very, very well. I noticed him mostly because he stayed until the very end, long after the others had drifted off toward their cars, standing near the edge of the plot with his hands folded in front of him like he was waiting for something. As I was leaving, he caught my eye for just a second and said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, "He talked about you more than anyone else in his life, you know. Take care of yourself, Wren." I remember thinking it was strange that a stranger knew my name, and stranger still that I never once thought to ask his. I was too busy trying to hold myself together long enough to get through a eulogy I'd written in the workshop the night before, surrounded by half-finished pieces that would never get finished now by the hands that started them. The will reading happened 3 weeks later, in my father's dining room, because that felt more comfortable to him than a lawyer's office, and looking back, I understand exactly why now. My father read through the document himself. He'd handled the estate planning years earlier. He explained, back when he first started helping with the finances, so it only made sense that he walk us through it. The workshop and the house it sat behind would be sold, he said, since neither Blythe nor I could take on the property and neither of our parents wanted the upkeep. The proceeds, along with what remained in Gus's accounts after the medical debt from his procedure years back and some other obligations that had built up, came to just under $60,000. Dad wanted that split fairly, my father said, folding the paper closed like the matter was already settled. But given everything, Corrine and I talked it over, and we think it makes more sense for it to go to Blythe. She and Grant just closed on the house. They could really use the boost right now. Wren, you're doing fine on your own, honey. You don't need it the way she does. I remember the specific silence that followed that sentence. Blythe didn't argue. She looked, if anything, a little uncomfortable, the way you look when you're handed something you know you probably shouldn't be handed, but want too badly to say no to. My mother reached over and patted my hand across the table, the exact gesture she'd use on a child who dropped an ice cream cone, and said, "You understand, don't you, sweetheart? You've always been the strong one." I said I understood. I want to be honest with you about that, because it's the part of this story I'm least proud of. I sat at that table, and I said the words "I understand" out loud, in a voice that came out calm and even, while something underneath my ribs quietly closed a door it had been holding open my entire life. I'd spent 8 years watching my father help with Gus's finances, and never once asking a single follow-up question. I'd spent 33 years being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need things the way my sister did, and somehow, every single time that label got handed to me, it came with a smaller and smaller piece of whatever was actually on the table. I drove home from that dinner in the dark, past the turn that used to lead to Gus's barn, and I didn't cry until I was 2 miles past it. And then I cried the whole rest of the way, not for the money, or not only for the money, but for the particular loneliness of being told your whole life that your strength is the reason you get less. If you've ever been told you're too strong, too capable, too fine on your own to deserve an equal share of something, comment, "the strong one," below, because I promise you, that sentence is doing more damage than anyone in your family will ever admit to. 3 weeks after that dinner, my father called to ask if I could handle clearing out Gus's workshop before the property closed. An estate sale company was already lined up for the tools and stock, he said, but somebody needed to go through the smaller things first, the personal items, before strangers started pricing tags on my grandfather's whole life. Neither he nor my mother wanted to do it. Blythe was busy with the new house. It fell to me, the way most quiet, unpaid, unglamorous family labor always seemed to fall to me. "I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened out there." I said yes immediately, and not out of obligation this time. I wanted to be the one to go through that barn. I wanted one more slow, quiet afternoon in the place that had raised me as much as any house ever had. I spent 3 full days out there before the estate company was scheduled to come. I cataloged tools I recognized by feel before I recognized them by sight. I found half-finished projects I'll never know the intended purpose of, sketches for pieces that never got built, a coffee can full of the exact kind of mismatched screws Gus always swore he'd sort out someday, and never did. It was slow, aching work, and I loved every single hour of it, right up until the 3rd afternoon, when I got down on my knees to clear out the space beneath his main workbench and noticed something that made every hair on my arms stand up at once. The bench had a support panel along the back, low, almost invisible unless you were kneeling exactly where I was kneeling, at exactly the angle I happened to be looking from. And the grain on that panel didn't match the rest of the bench. Not by much. Just enough that a person who'd spent her entire life learning to read wood the way other people read faces would notice it in half a second and nobody else in the world ever would. I ran my thumb along the seam the way he'd taught me to, feeling for a cut that wasn't true. It gave way at the 3rd try, sliding sideways with a soft, oiled click that told me, instantly, this hadn't been built in a hurry, and it hadn't been built recently either. Behind it was a shallow compartment, no bigger than a shoebox, and inside that compartment sat a small tin box I didn't recognize, and a folded slip of paper resting on top of it in handwriting I would have known anywhere in the world. For Wren, only Wren, ask Elias. I sat back on my heels on that workshop floor with sawdust in my hair and my grandfather's handwriting shaking slightly in my hands, and I understood, before I'd even opened the tin, that everything my father had told our family at that dining room table 3 weeks earlier was about to come apart in my hands. I sat on that workshop floor for a long time before I opened the tin. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me already understood that whatever was inside was going to rearrange something in my life, and once you know a container holds a truth you can't unknow, you can't put it back on the shelf unopened either. So I sat there with sawdust in my hair, my grandfather's handwriting in my lap, until my knees ached enough to force my hands to move. The tin held 3 things. A small brass key, old-fashioned, the kind that doesn't match anything modern. A folded business card, soft at the corners from years in that dark compartment, reading Ackhafer Fine Furniture and Estate Appraisal, Boston. And a single page in Gus's handwriting, dated almost exactly 8 years earlier, the same spring my father took over his finances. Wren, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And something in you finally looked close enough to notice this panel, which means you're exactly the person I always hoped would find it. I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I didn't want you carrying what I was carrying, and I didn't want to be the reason this family broke apart at my own dinner table. But I wasn't going to let it happen to you too, not without you having the whole truth in your hands when the time came. Go see Elias. He'll have the rest. I love you more than I ever found the right way to say out loud. You were always the one who understood what it means to build something true. Don't let anyone tell you it wasn't worth building. Gee. I sat in that empty barn and cried until the light outside started going orange. And then I drove home, and I didn't sleep more than an hour that whole night. Welcome back. If you've ever found out someone you loved was protecting you long before you ever knew you needed protecting, stay with me. Because what Elias told me 2 days later took 8 years of small, quiet cruelties and turned them into a single, undeniable shape. I called the number on that business card the next morning with my hands actually shaking, and a woman answered, professional and warm, and told me Mr. Ackhafer could see me Thursday afternoon if I could make the drive to Boston. I told her I'd be there. Elias Ackhafer turned out to be the man in the gray coat from the funeral, standing at the back of the plot, telling me my grandfather talked about me more than anyone else in his life. His gallery sat on a quiet side street, the kind of place with a bell over the door and museum lighting on pieces that looked, to my trained eye, worth more than my entire house. He met me himself, walked me back to a small office lined with photographs of furniture I recognized instantly. My grandfather's work, dovetail joints I could have picked out of a lineup blindfolded. I've been waiting a long time for this conversation, he said, once we were both seated, once he'd poured 2 cups of coffee neither of us really wanted. Gus and I did business together for almost 30 years. I represented pieces of his to collectors who understood what they were actually looking at, people willing to pay what real craftsmanship is worth instead of what a small-town commission usually pays. Some of his later pieces, the ones he built after your grandmother passed, went for numbers that would surprise you. Numbers he never once mentioned to his own family. "Why not?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the shape of the answer. Elias reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder thick enough to need a rubber band around it. "Because 8 years ago, your grandfather called me in a state I'd never heard from him before." Shaken. He'd gone to order lumber for a large commission, a dining set for a client in Connecticut, and discovered his business account held less than a third of what it should have. He assumed a bookkeeping error at first. It wasn't. He slid the folder across the desk to me. Inside was a ledger, Gus's own handwriting, dated entries going back 8 years, each one logged with the same precision he brought to every joint he ever cut. Dates. Amounts. A running total in the margin that climbed, entry by entry, higher than I could quite make my mind hold still enough to read. "He confronted your father once," Elias said. "Quietly, just the 2 of them, about 6 months after he first noticed the discrepancy. Your father told him it was a temporary business loan, that he'd pay it back once his own company steadied out, that Gus was being paranoid about numbers he didn't fully understand since he'd handed the accounts over. Gus let it go, publicly. Privately, he never stopped tracking every dollar." "How much?" I said, and I heard my own voice come out flat, the register I use when a scene has gone bad and somebody in the room needs to hear facts instead of feelings. "Just over $310,000 across 8 years, Elias said. "Documented, dated, cross-referenced against his own bank statements, which he started keeping separate copies of the moment he understood what was happening. He never confronted your father again after that first conversation. He told me once that he'd rather lose money than lose the last years he had left with his son, however complicated that relationship already was. But he wasn't willing to let it happen to you too. Once he understood what your father and mother were doing with the story of his estate, deciding ahead of time who deserved what, deciding you'd always be fine on your own. I want to tell you what it feels like to learn that your grandfather spent the last 8 years of his life quietly absorbing theft from his own son so the rest of the family wouldn't fracture, while somehow finding a way to still protect you from it anyway. I don't have a clean word for that feeling. The closest I can get is that it felt like grief and gratitude arriving in the same breath, tangled together so tightly I couldn't separate them even if I'd wanted to. "There's more," Elias said, and I felt my whole body brace before he'd even said it. "Once your grandfather understood what was happening, he asked me to start handling the sale of his finer pieces privately, off the books of his regular workshop accounts, into a trust he set up through a small credit union 2 towns over. A trust nomming you as sole beneficiary. He didn't tell your father it existed. He didn't tell your mother or your sister either. He told me, very specifically, that this money needed to sit somewhere your father could never reach it, could never even know to look for it, because he'd already watched him find his way into every account that was easy to find." He handed me a second folder, thinner, cleaner, the kind of paperwork that comes from an actual credit union with an actual trust officer's signature on it. Wren Larkin, sole beneficiary, established 8 years and 2 months earlier. Current balance, after appraisal fees and gallery commissions across nearly a decade of quiet, careful sales, $231,000. I sat in that office and stared at a number that meant my grandfather had spent nearly a decade secretly building me a second inheritance, piece by piece, sale by sale, while the family I'd grown up and decided out loud, at a dining room table, that I was already doing fine on my own and didn't need what little remained of his estate. "He wanted you to have it when the time was right," Elias said. "He left that decision to me, honestly, once I understood what your family did with the official reading of his will. I've been waiting to see whether you'd ever find that panel on your own. He always said you would. He said you were the only one who'd ever really learned to see the way he built things. If you've ever discovered someone loved you far more carefully and far longer than you ever knew, comment, the panel, below, Because I promise you, grief and gratitude really can arrive in the exact same breath, and it will knock the air clean out of you. Elias told me one more thing before I left his office that day, almost as an afterthought, the kind of detail that lands heaviest exactly because of how casually it's delivered. 3 years into the pattern, right around the time Blythe and her husband, Grant, made their down payment on their first house, Gus had noticed a particularly large withdrawal from his business account, nearly $40,000 in a single month. He'd never confirmed where it went. He'd simply written a single line in the ledger's margin next to that entry, in handwriting slightly heavier than the rest, like he'd pressed the pen down harder without meaning to. Ask if this bought the house. I drove home from Boston with that folder on the passenger seat, the same seat my father's own document had ridden on 3 weeks earlier at that dinner table, and I understood, somewhere on the highway, that I wasn't going to be able to just quietly accept a second inheritance and move on with my life. Not with that line in the margin sitting in my head. Not after 8 years of my grandfather absorbing this alone, out of love for a family that couldn't be bothered to give him an honest accounting in return. That night, I did something I hadn't thought to do in 15 years. I went into my own living room and really looked, at 3 pieces of furniture Gus had built me over the years. A jewelry box he gave me at 16, a writing desk he built for my college graduation, a small rocking chair he made the year I opened my own shop, delivered with nothing but a hug and the words, "Every good workshop needs somewhere to sit and think." I remembered, suddenly, with the kind of clarity that arrives all at once, that Gus had a signature technique for hidden compartments. A specific pressure point along a seam that released with a particular twist, one he'd taught me as a teenager as a kind of game, never explaining why a piece of furniture would ever need to hide something in the first place. I'd used the technique myself, on small pieces, for fun, for years, without ever once thinking to check whether he'd used it on the pieces he'd given me. The jewelry box gave way first. Inside, folded into a space no wider than my thumb, was a letter dated the year I turned 16, written years before any of this started, before there was even anything to hide, just a grandfather telling a granddaughter he was proud of the young woman she was becoming, that craft takes patience and patience takes love, and she had more of both than she probably knew yet. The writing desk held a second letter, dated the year I opened my shop, 3 years into the theft, though I didn't know that timeline yet, written in a hand slightly more careful than his usual scrawl, like he'd taken extra time with it. I watched you build something honest with your own 2 hands, Rennie, in a family that doesn't always value honest things. I want you to know I'm building something too, quietly, for you, and one day it'll be there when you need it. Don't ever let anyone convince you that your strength means you deserve less. I sat on my own living room floor that night with 2 letters spanning 17 years of my life spread out in front of me, and I understood, finally, completely, that my grandfather hadn't just been protecting money from my father. He'd been building a slow, patient, decade-spanning argument against every single time our family called me the strong one and handed the smaller piece to someone else instead. I called an attorney the next morning. Her name was Priya Chandrasekar, a probate and estate litigation specialist a colleague of mine had used years earlier for an unrelated matter, and I laid everything out for her over the phone before I'd even made it into her office. The ledger, the ratio of documented theft to documented trust, the letters, the line in the margin about Blythe's house. Priya was quiet for a moment after I finished. "Wren, I want to walk through 2 separate things with you, because they're legally distinct even though I understand they don't feel distinct to you at all right now. The trust your grandfather established through Elias and that credit union is almost certainly airtight. It was created while he was demonstrably of sound mind, properly documented, independently witnessed. Your father has no legal claim to it whatsoever, and frankly, he likely has no idea it exists." "And the other thing," I said. "The other thing is more complicated, and it's the part I think you actually called me about," she said. "Your father, as executor of your grandfather's official estate, had a fiduciary duty to disclose its true value and administer it honestly. If what you're describing is accurate, he misrepresented the estate's value to you and your sister, both as executor and, separately, as a man who spent 8 years diverting funds from his own father under a power of attorney meant to help him, not drain him. That's not just a family disagreement about fairness anymore. Depending on how you want to proceed, that's breach of fiduciary duty, potentially elder financial exploitation under Vermont statute, and fraud on the estate's actual beneficiaries. I asked her what my options actually were. "You have choices," she said. "You could pursue this quietly, through a formal accounting demand and possible restitution, kept entirely within legal channels, no family drama required. You could pursue it publicly, force a real reckoning your family can't manage or spin. Or you could decide the trust your grandfather left you is enough, walk away from the rest, and let your family keep believing whatever version of this story lets them sleep at night." I thought about that dining room table. My mother's hand on mine, the exact gesture you'd use on a child who dropped an ice cream cone. My father folding that paper closed like the matter was already settled. Blithe, uncomfortable but silent, taking what she knew, on some level she probably shouldn't have taken. I thought about my grandfather, 81 years old, still patching his own work boots with contact cement, while his son drove a new truck bought with money quietly bled out of an account he'd spent 50 years building. "There's a memorial dinner coming up," I told Priya. "The 1-year anniversary. My mother's hosting it at their house. Everyone will be there." "And you want to bring this there," she said. It wasn't really a question. "I want them to hear it from him," I said, "before they hear it from anyone else. I want to read them my grandfather's own words, in his own handwriting, in the house he built half of, before my father gets a chance to control the story the way he's controlled every story in this family for 8 years. Priya was quiet for a second. Then she said the thing that settled it for me completely. "I can have a formal accounting demand and a summary of Vermont's elder financial exploitation statute ready for you by then, alongside whatever you choose to bring yourself. You won't be standing in that dining room with just letters and a feeling this time, Wren. You'll be standing there with law behind you too." I spent the next 2 weeks preparing the way I prepare everything, methodically, quietly, the way Gus taught me to approach any piece of work worth doing right. I made copies of the ledger. I made copies of the trust documents. I photographed both letters exactly as I'd found them, still folded into the compartments that had hidden them for years, before I ever removed them, because Priya told me documentation of exactly where and how something is found matters more than people expect it to. 2 nights before the dinner, I drove back out to Millbridge one last time, past the empty lot where the workshop had already been cleared for its new owners, and sat in my car at the edge of that property for a long time, the way you sit somewhere you know you're saying goodbye to, even though the goodbye already happened months earlier, and you just hadn't let yourself feel the whole weight of it yet. I thought about the birdhouse still sitting on a shelf in my own shop. I thought about a gray coat at the back of a funeral. I thought about a margin note in handwriting pressed slightly too hard into the page. "Ask if this bought the house." I thought, too, about something Priya had said almost in passing, near the end of our second call, when I'd asked her whether she thought I was doing the right thing by bringing any of this into a family dinner, instead of keeping it contained to lawyers and paperwork. "There's no version of this that doesn't hurt someone, Wren," she told me. "The only real choice you have is whether the truth gets to be part of the story, or whether it stays buried in a workbench for another generation to maybe never find at all." I hadn't fully understood, sitting outside that empty lot, how much I needed to hear that sentence out loud from someone other than myself. I drove home, and I packed a folder of my own, and 2 nights later, I walked into my parents' dining room for the 1-year memorial dinner, and I set a small wooden box on the table. My parents' dining room looked the way it always looked for occasions that mattered to my mother, the good tablecloth out, candles she only ever lit for company, a framed photo of Gus propped up on the sideboard between 2 vases of white flowers he would have thought were an unnecessary expense. 12 people, not 80, not a courtroom, just family and the handful of people close enough to be treated like family. My Aunt Ruth, my mother's sister, down from New Hampshire. An old family friend, Marion, who used to trade garden vegetables for Gus's cutting boards every summer. My parents, Blythe and her husband, Grant, and me, standing in the doorway with a small wooden box in both hands, walking in on the middle of a toast. Grant had his glass raised. Blythe stood beside him, glowing in a way I recognized instantly, the specific glow of someone about to announce the biggest thing in their life. "We wanted to wait until we were all together for this," she was saying, "especially with it being a year since Grandpa. We're having a baby, due in the spring." The room erupted into the kind of noise a good announcement deserves. My mother's hands flying to her face, my aunt already crying, Grant grinning wider than I'd ever seen him grin. I stood in the doorway holding a box full of my grandfather's secrets, watching my family celebrate a genuinely joyful thing, and for one terrible second I almost turned around and drove home instead. Then my mother spotted me. "Wren, come in, you're just in time, did you hear?" "I heard," I said, and I meant it more ways than she understood yet. "Welcome back. If you've ever had to walk into the happiest moment your family had shared in years carrying the thing that was about to end it, stay with me. Because what happened over the next 20 minutes in that dining room is the reason none of us will ever sit at that table the same way again." "And that's not even all of it," Blythe said, still riding the high of the announcement, pulling her phone out before I'd even set the box down. "We finally started the nursery. I've been documenting the whole renovation for the page, and honestly, it's some of my best work yet." She turned the screen toward the room, scrolling through photos of a half-finished room, soft yellow walls, a crib already assembled, custom built-in shelving that must have cost more than my monthly mortgage. "We used some of what Grandpa left us for the built-ins. I really think he'd love that it went toward this, don't you think? New life in the family and everything." I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold at the same time. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," my mother said, beaming at both of them. "Gus would be so proud." Marion leaned over to admire the phone screen, murmuring something about crown molding, and my Aunt Ruth reached across the table to squeeze Blythe's hand. And for one more suspended second, the whole room still belonged to the happy version of this evening. I remember thinking, standing there with the box heavy in my hands, that I would have given almost anything to just set it down somewhere quiet and let that version keep existing a little longer. I set the box down on the table, right beside the framed photo of him, and the room quieted a little, assuming, reasonably, that I was about to add something to the tribute already underway. "I have something too," I said, "something I found out in his workshop clearing it out." My father's face did something small and careful, the particular expression of a man bracing without knowing exactly what he's bracing for. "That's sweet, Wren," he said. "Save it for after dinner, though, we're right in the middle of." "I'd like to do it now," I said, quiet, even the voice I use when a scene is turning and everyone in the room needs to hear facts instead of noise. "It won't take long." I opened the box and took out the folded letter first, the one addressed simply to me, and I read it out loud. I want you to understand what that felt like, reading my grandfather's private words to me in front of the same table that had decided, 1 year earlier, that I didn't need whatever he'd left behind. My aunt was crying again by the second sentence. My mother had her hand pressed to her chest. Even my father looked, for just a moment, like the son who'd once played catch with a man he never called Dad out loud. "I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I didn't want you carrying what I was carrying, and I didn't want to be the reason this family broke apart at my own dinner table. But I wasn't going to let it happen to you too." "That's lovely," my mother said, wiping her eyes, already reaching for the next course, already assuming the moment was over. "He always had a way with words for you, didn't he?" "There's more," I said. I set the ledger on the table next. My father's eyes found it before anyone else's, and I watched something shift behind them, recognition arriving a half-second before understanding did, the way it does when you glimpse something you've spent years hoping you'd never have to look at directly. "Grandpa noticed money missing from his business account 8 years ago," I said, into a room that had gone completely silent now. "Around the same time Dad took over managing his finances. He kept a record of every discrepancy from that point forward, every date, every amount." I opened the ledger to the last page, where the running total sat in the margin, and I turned it so the whole table could see it. $310,000 over 8 years. "Wren, My father's voice came out low, warning, the tone he used when I was a kid about to say something he needed me to stop saying. This is not the time or the place. You told all of us the estate was worth almost nothing, I said, and I kept my voice level even as my hands, out of sight beneath the table's edge, were shaking. You told us there was barely $60,000 left after his medical debt. You stood in this exact room and gave every bit of it to Blythe, and told me I didn't need my share because I was, and I remember this exactly, already doing fine on my own. I want to know where the other $310,000 went, Dad. That's not what this money was, he said, and his voice had climbed now, sharp enough that Grant reached over and put a hand on Blythe's arm, the instinctive gesture of someone bracing for impact. Those were loans, temporary loans, from a business account I was managing, and I fully intended to pay every dollar of it back once things stabilized. You have no idea what it's like running a company that's struggling, Wren, none, sitting comfortably in your little workshop, while the rest of us actually carry the weight of this family. Grandpa carried it, I said, for 8 years, quietly, while you took a new truck the same spring he had to turn down commissions for the first time in 50 years, while you stood at this table and lied to your own daughters about what he actually left behind. How dare you, my mother said, finding her voice at last, sharp and rising. How dare you turn a memorial for your grandfather into an ambush at this family's table, tonight of all nights, when your sister just told us the most wonderful news of her life. After everything this family has done for you, Wren, everything we sacrificed to raise you, you sit there with a folder like you're building a legal case against your own parents. Nobody built this case but Grandpa, I said. I just finally read it. You've always done this, my mother went on, and I recognized the shift immediately, the old, practiced turn toward my character instead of the facts on the table, the same maneuver she'd used my whole life whenever a conversation got somewhere she didn't want it to go. Even as a little girl, you'd rather dig up something ugly than just let a good moment be good. Your sister is having a baby, Wren. Could you not have given her one night? I would have, I said, and I meant it, and I think something in my voice made her believe me. If Dad hadn't been the one deciding, 1 year ago, at this exact table, that I didn't deserve an equal share of what Grandpa actually left behind. I didn't choose tonight because I wanted to ruin something good. I chose it because I wasn't going to let another year go by with only half of us knowing the truth. I'd like to know what's happening, Blythe said, and her voice cut through both of them, quiet in a way I'd never once heard from her. She was looking at our father now, not me. Dad, is any of this true? My father didn't answer right away. That silence told her more than any denial could have. Dad, she said again, and something in her had gone very still. The down payment on our house, 3 years ago, you told us that was from a business deal that finally paid off. Was it actually his money? I hadn't planned to bring up that specific number. Not yet. Not until later in the conversation if it came up at all. But my grandfather had already written the question for me, in a margin, in handwriting pressed slightly too hard into the page, and I realized, sitting there, that some truths simply arrive at the moment they're ready to, whether you've scheduled them or not. I opened the ledger back to the entry 3 years earlier and turned it toward my sister instead of my father. $40,000 withdrawn in a single month, and beside it, in Gus's own hand, 6 words that landed in that dining room like a dropped plate. Ask if this bought the house. Blythe read it twice. I watched her face do something I'd genuinely never seen it do before, the practiced ease she always carried, the glow from 20 minutes earlier, all of it draining out of her at once, replaced by something rower and much less comfortable to watch. Dad, she said a third time, and her voice cracked clean down the middle. Answer me. It was going to be yours eventually anyway, my father said, and I understood in that moment that he had finally stopped trying to defend himself to me and started trying to defend himself to her instead, because some part of him had already calculated that losing me was a cost he could absorb, but losing Blythe wasn't. The house, the inheritance, all of it. I was just moving the timeline up for you when you actually needed it, instead of waiting for some arbitrary date on a will. I did it for this family. I did it for you and Grant. For the baby you didn't even know you were having yet. I don't understand why that makes me a villain." "You didn't move a timeline, Dad," Blythe said, and her voice had gone somewhere I'd never heard it go before, low and hard and entirely without its usual gloss. "You took money from a man who repaired his own work boots with glue because he couldn't justify a new pair, and you let me post pictures of a nursery online like it was some kind of sweet family gift, and you let me thank him in the caption. I thanked a dead man for something you stole from him." "Because it wasn't yours to move," I said, quieter, once Blythe had gone silent again. "It was never yours at all. It was his, and he spent 8 years watching you take it, and instead of fighting you for it, he spent that same 8 years quietly protecting what was left from you, specifically, because he'd stopped trusting you with anything of real value a long time before any of us understood why." I set the second folder on the table, the trust documents, the balance sheet, the credit union letterhead with an actual officer's signature on it. "There's a separate trust, established through a friend of his named Elias Ackhafer, who represented his best pieces to collectors for years, pieces most of you never even knew were worth what they were worth, because Dad never let any of us see the real numbers on anything. $231,000, held in my name alone, that Dad has never known existed until right now." The silence that followed that sentence was different from every silence before it. My father stared at the folder like it might disappear if he looked at it long enough. My mother had stopped crying entirely, her face gone flat and unreadable in a way that scared me more than her anger had. "You went behind this family's back," she said finally, quiet, venomous. "You let a stranger help you hide money from your own father." "He was already hiding it from his own son," I said. "I just finally found where." Grant stood up then, and I think it surprised everyone at the table, including him. He was a quiet man, the kind who mostly listened at family gatherings and let Blythe do the talking, and his voice, when it came, was steady in a way that cut through the whole room. "I think we should hear the rest of this," he said, looking at Blythe, then at me. "All of it, because I'd like to understand exactly what we built a nursery with before we let our daughter grow up in a house nobody was honest about." My Aunt Ruth had gone very quiet in her seat, watching all of this unfold with an expression I couldn't quite place until she spoke, low, mostly to my mother. "Corrine, did you know about any of this?" My mother didn't answer that question either. I noticed. I don't think I was the only one. I told them the rest of it, then methodically, the way Gus taught me to approach anything worth doing right. The heart scare 8 years ago, the power of attorney that never got handed back. The single confrontation Gus had with my father, quietly, privately, 6 months into the pattern, and the excuse my father had given him that night, the same excuse he'd just given this table. A temporary loan, a business that would steady out, a promise that never once got kept in 8 years. "I'm not here to burn this family down," I said, once I'd laid all of it out, once the room had gone as quiet as I think it was capable of going. "I want to be honest about that, because I know how this looks right now. I'm here because Grandpa spent 8 years being the only honest person in this story, and I wasn't going to let that end the day we buried him." I took one more piece of paper out of the folder, the formal accounting demand Priya had drafted, and slid it across the table to my father. "You have 30 days to provide a full accounting of Grandpa's business finances for the past 8 years, through my attorney. After that, I'll decide what comes next, and I want you to understand that decision is genuinely still open. I haven't decided to sue you. I haven't decided to walk away either. I came here tonight because I wanted you to hear the truth from his own words, in his own house, before anyone got to control the story the way you've controlled every story in this family for 8 years. I closed the empty box, the one that had held the letter, and I stood up. My father didn't say anything. My mother didn't either. Blythe sat frozen beside Grant, one hand resting, almost without her noticing, over her still flat stomach, staring at a margin note her grandfather had written 3 years before she'd ever have a reason to read it. I walked out of that dining room the same way I'd walked in, quietly, carrying something heavier than when I'd arrived. Nobody followed me to the door. I heard, just before it closed behind me, my mother's voice starting up again, lower now, already working to smooth something back into place, and my father's chair scraping back from the table, and underneath both of those sounds, Blythe very quietly, saying, "Don't, Mom. Just don't right now." I made it as far as my car before my hands finally stopped being steady, and I sat there in the dark for a long time, engine off, staring at the house I'd grown up in, wondering which version of my family, if any, was going to still exist on the other side of those 30 days. I didn't know yet that Blythe would call me at 11 o'clock that same night, once everyone else had finally gone quiet, and that what she told me would change almost everything I thought I understood about how this was going to end. Blythe called at 11 that night, and I almost let it go to voicemail. I'd been sitting in my own kitchen for 2 hours by then, still in the clothes I'd worn to that dinner, staring at a cup of tea I'd made and never touched. When I finally picked up, I could hear that she'd been crying, the specific rawness of someone who's been crying long enough that their voice has started to give out. "I need you to send me everything," she said, before I'd even said hello. "The ledger, the trust papers, all of it. I want to see it myself, not secondhand, not filtered through Mom trying to explain it away in the kitchen for the last 2 hours. I asked her if she was okay. It felt like a strange question to ask, given everything, but it was the only one that actually mattered to me in that moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "I keep thinking about the caption I wrote for that nursery post. I thanked him, Wren. I thanked a dead man, publicly, for a kindness my father stole from him. I've been sitting with that for 2 hours, and I don't think I'm going to stop feeling sick about it for a long time." I told her I'd send everything in the morning. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing that actually surprised me, the thing I hadn't expected from her in 100 years of imagining how this night might go. "I'm so sorry, Wren, not just for tonight, for all of it. For every time I got the new thing and you got the second-hand one and I never once asked why, because it was easier not to. I think some part of me always knew I was the favorite, and I let myself enjoy it instead of looking too closely at what it was costing you." Her voice broke on the last few words. "I don't expect you to forgive that tonight. I just needed you to hear me say it. I want to be honest with you about what that apology did to me, sitting alone in my kitchen at 11 at night. It didn't fix 8 years. It didn't undo a single dollar. But it was the first time in my entire life that anyone in my family had looked directly at the shape of what happened to me and called it by its real name instead of dressing it up as fairness. I cried harder over that phone call than I had over almost anything else in the whole ordeal, and I think Blythe did too. And for a little while we just stayed on the line together, not talking much, the way you do with someone you're finally, actually starting to know. Before we hung up, she told me something else, almost as an afterthought, the kind of detail that lands heaviest exactly because of how quietly it's offered. "I keep thinking about the wedding too," she said. "Grant and I paid for most of it ourselves, but there was a chunk right before that Mom and Dad just handed over, said it was a gift, no strings. I never questioned it. Why would I have? I want to go back through everything now, Wren, all of it. I don't want to find out in 5 years that there's another margin note somewhere with my name near it." I told her I understood completely, because I'd spent the last 2 weeks doing exactly that with my own life, running back through every gift, every unexpected kindness, every moment I'd been told I was fine on my own, looking for the ones that had actually cost someone else something they never got to choose. Welcome back. If you've ever gotten the apology you didn't know you were still waiting for, stay with me, because the next 30 days taught me more about who my family actually was than the 8 years before them ever did. My father hired a lawyer within the week, which I understood, and which Priya had already prepared me for. What I didn't expect was how quickly his lawyer's tone shifted once she'd actually reviewed the ledger, the trust documents, and Elias' willingness to provide a sworn statement about the timeline of events. Priya told me, on our first call after the initial exchange of letters, that opposing counsel had asked for an early settlement conversation, which in her experience meant one thing. "They know they can't win this in front of a judge," she said. "The question now is just how much of a fight your father wants to put up before he accepts that." He put up less of a fight than I expected, honestly, and more than I'd hoped. The first offer his lawyer floated was insulting, a token sum meant to make the whole thing quietly disappear without any real accounting of where 8 years of money had actually gone. Priya rejected it without even bringing it to me. "They're testing whether you'll fold out of guilt," she told me on the phone. "Families do that constantly in these cases. The first offer is never a real offer. It's a question, dressed up as a number, asking whether you actually mean it. I told her I meant it. The second offer, 3 weeks later, came with a longer letter attached, one my father had apparently insisted on writing himself, half legal argument and half something closer to a wounded man trying to explain himself to a room he could no longer control. Priya read me the relevant parts over the phone, flat and professional, though I could hear, underneath her voice, that even she found some of it hard to get through without pausing. He wrote that he'd never intended for it to reach the amount it reached. That the first loan, 8 years ago, really had been meant to be temporary, a bridge through one bad quarter, and that each year after that had simply made the debt feel too large to ever admit to, so he'd kept not admitting to it instead, the way you keep not looking at a bill you already know you can't pay. I didn't feel much sympathy reading that. I want to be honest about that too. I understood the psychology of it, the way small dishonesties calcify into large ones simply through the passage of time and the absence of anyone forcing a reckoning. I understood it, and I still thought about a man patching his own boots with glue while his son drove a truck bought with money he never had the right to take. Understanding a thing and forgiving it were never going to be the same currency for me, not with this. The third offer, 6 weeks after the dinner, was the one we finally accepted. My father agreed, in a signed, legally binding settlement, to a full written accounting of every withdrawal from Gus's accounts over the 8 years he'd held power of attorney. He agreed to restitution of $200,000, paid over 4 years, secured against his company's assets, which turned out, once an independent appraiser looked at his books, to be worth considerably less than he'd always let the family believe. He agreed, in writing, that the $60,000 distributed to Blythe from the official estate had been based on a materially false representation of the estate's value, and that going forward, any further disputes about that distribution would be handled directly between me and Blythe, outside of him. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than the dollar figures. I didn't take the settlement because I needed the money. My grandfather's trust had already made sure of that. I took it because I needed there to be a real, documented, undeniable record, the same kind Gus had kept in that ledger for 8 patient years, of exactly what had actually happened. Some things you fight for because you need them. Some things you fight for because somebody who can't fight anymore needed you to. My mother never signed anything, because there was nothing legally for her to sign, and I think that technicality let her avoid the one thing I actually wanted from her, which was an honest word. She called me twice during those 30 days. The first call was an attempt to guilt me back into silence, the same tone from the dining room, dressed up softer over the phone. The second call, near the end of the month, was different, quieter, and for a moment I let myself hope. "I hope you understand," she said, "that your father was only ever trying to keep this family afloat." I told her I did understand that, actually, better than she probably realized, because Gus had understood it too, and had still decided, 8 years ago, that keeping his family afloat didn't require lying to the rest of us about what he had left to give. She didn't have a response to that. We had lunch once, that following summer, at her suggestion, the kind of careful, neutral ground lunch you agree to when you're both testing whether something can still exist between you. She spent most of it talking about Blythe's daughter, about the weather, about a neighbor's renovation, circling anything that might actually require her to say something true out loud. Near the end, almost as we were leaving, she said, "I do wish you'd handled it differently. Quietly. Within the family." I told her I had tried quietly for 8 years, without ever once knowing there was anything to be quiet about, and that the only person in this family who'd ever actually handled any of it quietly, on purpose, with real cost to himself, was the one none of us had bothered to ask. She didn't have a response to that either. We haven't had lunch again since. I think, of everyone at that table, she's the one who's changed the least, and some days that hurts more than my father's theft ever did, and other days I've simply made my peace with the fact that not every relationship gets to heal on the timeline you'd choose for it. Blythe, though. Blythe surprised me every week of those 30 days, and she's kept surprising me in the year since. She took the nursery post down within days of that dinner, and a week later, posted something entirely different in its place. No photos of the built-ins, just a plain gray square of text. I shared something recently that I'm no longer comfortable having up. I found out this month that a gift I believed was a kindness from my late grandfather actually came from money taken from him without his knowledge. I'm still working through what that means for my family, but I didn't want to keep benefiting from a story I now know wasn't true. Thank you for understanding. It cost her, publicly, in a way I know mattered to her professionally, and she posted it anyway, without asking me first, without needing me to tell her it was the right thing to do. She insisted, against my objection, on paying me back a portion of the original $60,000 once she and Grant were in a position to do it, a monthly amount that started small and grew as her business did. I told her more than once she didn't have to. She told me, every time, that she wasn't doing it because she had to. She was doing it because she finally understood the difference between a gift and a debt, and she wasn't willing to keep confusing the two anymore, not with me, and not, she said, with the daughter she was about to raise. Her daughter was born the following March. They named her Faye after our grandmother, which nobody asked me about in advance and which still, when I first heard it, sat me down hard on my own kitchen floor for the second time in less than a year. Blythe called to tell me before she told our parents, which I understood to be its own kind of statement, even though neither of us said so out loud. She brought baby Faye by the shop that same summer, tiny and sleeping in a carrier against her chest, and stood in the middle of the floor turning slowly, taking in the tools, the half-finished pieces, the light coming through the big windows I'd finally been able to afford. I never once asked to see this growing up, she said, quiet, mostly to herself. Not really see it. I used to think it was just sawdust and old men talking about wood. She looked down at her daughter, then back up at me. I want her to know what this actually is, what it actually meant. Would you teach her someday, when she's old enough to hold a sander without losing a finger? I told her I'd already been planning on it, and I meant it, and something in that conversation felt like the first real thread of a relationship I'd never quite had with my sister before, built on something truer than the roles we'd both been handed as kids. I want to tell you what I did with the trust, because I think it matters more than any single dollar figure in this whole story. I didn't touch most of it for almost a year. I let it sit, the way Gus let his own patience sit for 8 years, while I figured out what I actually wanted to build with something he'd spent a decade quietly protecting. What I landed on, eventually, was this. I used a portion of it to expand my own shop, doubling the space, bringing on my first 2 employees, both of them young people who'd never had access to real training in the trade, the way I'd had access to Gus's barn every weekend of my childhood, free, because nobody in my family thought what happened out there was worth paying attention to. I renamed the shop that spring. It's called Augustus and Bow now, and there's a small plaque by the front door that says nothing about money, nothing about lawsuits, nothing about any of the 8 years that led me there. It just says the thing he used to tell me, running his thumb along a seam, testing whether a cut was true. Anybody can make something look finished. Took me 40 years to learn how to make something actually be finished. I used another piece of the trust to fund something I call the Larkin apprenticeship. One paid, year-long spot every fall for a young person who couldn't otherwise afford to learn a trade like this one properly. Room and board covered, tools provided, exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous investment Gus made in me for 20 years without ever once asking anyone to notice or thank him for it. My first apprentice, a 19-year-old named Dara who'd been sanding furniture in her uncle's garage with no formal training at all, showed up the first week barely speaking, the way you speak when you've spent your whole life being told the thing you're good at isn't worth pursuing. By the 3rd month, she was correcting my joinery before I'd finished the sentence explaining it. She finished her year this past spring and opened her own small shop 2 towns over, and on her opening day, she hung a single hand-lettered sign by the door, not a business slogan, just a sentence she told me she'd been carrying around in a notebook since her first week with me. A cut is only true if it doesn't need covering up. I drove out for her opening day the way Gus used to drive out for mine, quietly, no announcement, just showing up because showing up was always the whole conversation that mattered most in my family, on the rare occasions anyone actually did it. I stood at the back of her shop, the way that man in the gray coat once stood at the back of a funeral, and I understood, for the first time all the way through my chest, exactly what it must have felt like for Gus to watch me build the same thing, all those years ago, without ever needing anyone to make it about him. My father and I talk sometimes now, carefully, the way you talk to someone you're still deciding how much room to make for. He finished his restitution payments on schedule, every single one, which I'll give him credit for, even though I understand that credit and forgiveness aren't the same currency, and I'm not sure yet how much of the second one he's actually earned. He asked me, this past winter, if he could see the shop sometime, and I said yes, and he came, and he stood in the doorway for a long time looking at a wall of tools that used to belong to his own father, tools he apparently never once picked up in his entire childhood. And he said, quietly, I never understood what any of this was. Did I? I thought it was just a hobby he never grew out of. I walked him through the shop slowly, the way I'd walk a stranger through it, showing him pieces in progress, explaining joints he'd never once had explained to him growing up, and somewhere near the end of that hour, standing beside the rocking chair Gus had given me the day I opened my own doors, my father asked if he could sit in it. I said yes. He sat there a long time without saying anything, running his hand along the armrest the same slow way I'd watched Gus run his thumb along a seam my whole childhood, testing something, though I don't think my father entirely knew what he was testing for. I thought providing for this family meant making sure nobody ever had to feel what I felt growing up, he said finally, not quite looking at me. We didn't have much. I used to watch my own father turn down work because he was too proud to charge what it was worth, and I told myself I'd never let that happen to my own kids. I think somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that taking from him wasn't really taking, because I was going to fix it, because I was building something better for all of you with it. I know now that's not what it was. I don't have a better way to say it than that. I told him it wasn't a hobby, what Gus built out there. It was the one place in this whole family where honesty was actually load-bearing, where a joint either held or it didn't, where you couldn't paper over a bad cut and call it fine. I don't know if that landed the way I meant it to. I think it might have. I think, some days, that's enough to keep the door open a crack, the way Gus kept his door open to a son he never fully trusted again, but never fully shut out either. Elias still calls a few times a year, mostly just to check in, occasionally to let me know a piece of Gus's work has come up at auction somewhere, changing hands for a number that would have made my grandfather laugh out loud in that specific, disbelieving way he had. I went to see one, once, a small side table Gus built the year I was born, sitting in a private collector's dining room 3 states away, and I stood in front of it for a long time, running my thumb along a seam the way he taught me, feeling for a cut that wasn't true. I didn't find one. I never do in his work. That was always the whole point of everything he ever built. I keep the little brass key from that first tin box on a hook above my own workbench now, not because it opens anything anymore, but because it reminds me every single morning what patience actually looks like when it's done right. 8 years of silence that wasn't really silence at all. 8 years of a man choosing, again and again, to protect what mattered instead of proving he was right. I don't think I'll ever build anything that measures up to that kind of quiet. I think I'll spend the rest of my life trying anyway, one true joint at a time, because that's the only inheritance that ever actually mattered. Here's what I know now, and I wish someone had told the 9-year-old at that gymnasium father-daughter woodworking day, sitting there with a half-finished birdhouse and a growing understanding that she'd been the one nobody thought to show up for. Being called the strong one is not a compliment when it's used to justify giving you less. Reliability is not the same thing as being owed nothing. And the people who truly see you, the way my grandfather saw me for 33 years, will spend their whole lives quietly building you a way back to what's yours, even if you never once know they're doing it until the day you finally learn to look. That's my story. One hidden panel, one tin box, a margin note 6 words long that changed everything my family thought it understood about itself. If you've ever been told you were too strong, too capable, too fine on your own to deserve your fair share, go find the proof of what you actually built, and don't let anyone talk you out of reading it out loud. If this reached you, send it to the reliable one in your own family. They need to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, I'll see you in the next one.